Welcome to our Influencers in Accounting podcast with me, Rob Brown. And on behalf of the Accounting Influencers Podcast Network, 5 shows going out every day of the week, 5 altogether. This is our deep dive show where we bring on a special guest and interview them. These are people that have been around the block. They've done their thing. They've got a great reputation. They've got a huge amount of expertise. And I'm thrilled to have with me today one of the legends of the accounting and fintech game. It is Donny SHIMAMOTO. Hello, sir.
Hi, Rob. Wow, I think that's the first time I've been called a legend. So
Does that sit well
thank
with you?
you.
Are you okay with that and ego and everything else, Donny?
I don't know. I thought, I don't know, do you have to be old to be a legend? Does that mean I'm old now?
Well, we'll obviously let the listeners make up their own mind after hearing what you've got to say. But it is thrilling to have you on the show, Donny. For people that haven't come across you, tell us real quick about you and your world.
Sure, thank you. So I often describe myself as a non-traditional CPA, and I actually have a CPA firm, but we don't do audit, tax, or bookkeeping. The only thing that we do is business transformations. And that really comes kind of in two different maybe aspects. The first is really more innovation. That's what most people associate me with is technology, innovation. But as many of us learned in the pandemic, innovation is not just about technology, it's also about changes in business practices. And so, for example, with hybrid work, it wasn't just about putting Zoom and all these other tools in people's hands. If you only did that, you probably are losing people now because you needed to adapt the way that you led people. You needed to adapt the way that you managed work. And so that's one side of what we do. And then we balance that with risk management. And I often like to say integrated risk management because it's the whole picture of risk rather than just the financial picture of risk, which we're normally dealing with as accountants. Some people call it enterprise risk management. I don't like to call it that because we deal with primarily small and mid-sized organizations and small and mid-sized firms. And so enterprise people think big, but it is the whole spectrum of enterprise risk management. We've just right-sized it down to small and mid-size.
Mm. And we're going to get you on it for a couple of shows, Donny. You've got so many areas of expertise. I'm intrigued by this concept of accounting transformation because accountants are not necessarily known for their ability to transform and pivot on a dime and their agility. And even when you mention the word innovation there, CPAs and their ilk, they're not known for that. So let's kick off by asking you just a general question. What kind of shape do you feel the accounting profession is in right now?
Actually, let's back up a little bit. So that statement that you said that accountants are not known for being
Are you
innovative.
going to educate me
Um,
and put me
I,
straight?
I, I think it's actually relative. So if you look at where the accounting world is compared to the other learned professions,
Okay.
medicine, law, even education,
Yeah.
like all of these type of technology tools, we were way ahead than any of the other professions. Look at even the adoption, for example, of social media. You and I were talking earlier about being on LinkedIn Live.
Yeah.
We have been using these, especially people, well, like Tom Hood, who we just discussed.
Yeah.
We've been using these for what, 10 years, maybe even actually more than that. Because I
Mm.
know my first time on Twitter was 2008 or 2009, I think. And I was maybe not a total late adopter, but I was maybe not the second or I was maybe the second wave of adoption in that. So our profession, despite what people may think, actually is quite forward and looking at these innovations and incorporating them into the way that maybe not necessarily the way that we do accounting, but they're definitely a part of our profession. So I always like to kind of correct that one, to really look at even, the whole use of ERPs and all of these things, like those are things that we drive and incorporate into organizations. Cloud computing, like all of this stuff, those are the things that we're bringing in.
I understand, and I feel educated on that point. That perhaps you're slightly not representative, Donny, in that you are very much an innovator. You're an entrepreneurial thinker. The profession as a whole might not be at the early adopter stage of the curve like you are, in that you're slightly unrepresentative. We've got some stats that suggest here in the UK only about 9% of firms and therefore accountants are in that early adopter phase where they will look at new technology, they will proactively innovate what they're doing in their firms. But
Yeah.
obviously you accelerate them in what you do with what you call accounting transformation. So I want to
Right.
ask you more about that, and we'll talk about your Center for Accounting Transformation in a minute. But let's just define that
Sure.
term. in your dictionary of life and business, what does transformation mean for accountants?
Sure, sure. So with transformation, and we're purposely using the word transformation because transformative change is much more larger and holistic. And you heard me already kind of allude towards that with the integrated risk management.
Yeah.
So how are we driving truly transformative change, holistic change, in all aspects of accounting, and recognizing again that accounting is not just finance. Because when you look at especially mid-sized organization, controllers in mid-sized organizations often oversee IT, they also oversee HR. And so it's a lot of changes, and I might even say business practice changes as a whole. So looking at, again, the whole picture of an organization and how do we manage that change accordingly. And this is where the accounting side is going to come in. How do we look at the risks associated with changes and what are the controls or the strategies that we might use, change management strategies that we may use to ensure that we're getting adoption of these changes that we're bringing in. And when you do larger scale or maybe whole scale change, it is a lot more risky. That's why, as I mentioned earlier, we balance innovation with risk management. Because if you just push forward, innovate, 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 you're operating more like a startup. And none of us want to be in that startup phase. Well, I think as accountants, maybe I should say, none of us want to be in that startup phase. I definitely agree with you that our profession tends to wait for things to kind of stabilize per se, or at least have some best practices start to come out. But once those do start to come out, we see a lot more. And because I really I heard you say the stat, and I'm thinking, in the U.S. I know that we see a lot more larger firms adopting things, pushing things forward. They're just not as vocal or about it, because when I start to talk to firms about things, I hear like, oh, you actually are doing that. Oh, you're actually experimenting with that. And it may not be that they adopt it, but part of that is because it is managing this full scale change. And especially in tax and audit, in the US in particular, again, we have these core busy seasons that everyone's affected by. And so to adopt a wholesale change, it takes a lot more, and it does need to be more mature of a technology when we get there. So accounting transformation really, again, kind of in a bigger picture, not just technology, not just innovation for itself, but really this holistic change as we go through things.
That makes sense. Accountants obviously are in the business of managing risk. That's their bread and butter, isn't it? But the innovative side of it is it's an interesting angle. Talk to us about the Center for Accounting Transformation, Donny. How did that come about? What are you doing there?
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's like this has been a passion project of mine, and we actually started the first conversations around this. It's actually 6 years ago, I think now. I got a group together. It was actually mostly practitioners, but we actually had some vendor representatives as well because we saw that the large institutions in our profession were not really pushing the profession forward, and we're really looking out for big business and public companies. And we started these discussions around what do we need to do, or how do we help the rest of the profession really start to come in and adopt these things. And over the course of those years, I've been working to figure out like how do we actually do this? What do we actually do? And so last year we launched this Center for Accounting Transformation, really focused on small and mid-sized firms and small and mid-sized businesses. And what we're doing in the center is we're identifying what we call blueprints. So we have this concept of enterprise blueprints. Most people know me as with EntrapriseTechKnowlogies, my firm. So the word enterprise is really the internal workings of an organization. So it's effectively accounting, HR, and IT. And what we're doing is we're identifying these blueprints, which allow us to have a model that with the lower complexity, usually in small and mid-sized businesses, we're able to take this model and have them follow this model and then the business practices associated with that. So a lot of these are process models, but they also have some business practices changes that come with them. So for example, the adoption of value pricing, one of the things we work with is the the automation of the tax return and how do we look at that. So that's workflow. It's also looking at all the sets of solutions that are in there. And then what are the business practice changes, like switch to value pricing rather than doing hourly pricing. So it's really looking at all of these different aspects, not just in tax. We're also looking at audit. We're looking at finance. We're looking at the way that a firm operates, so practice management. And our big emphasis right now with everyone struggling for people is the changes to people practices. So there's a lot of like HR consultants out there that are talking about employee engagement and doing all this stuff. So they're only looking at it through the one lens. We're also looking at it through what technologies actually support this, what business practices changes. For example, the adoption of agile methodologies into accounting, and how do I use that for work management or even workflow management, and what solutions tie together. So we're really trying to bring all of these different perspectives together to get a transformative solution in the people area.
That does make so much sense in splitting accounting transformation into various sections, because transformation is an overwhelming word. And you'll probably find, you talk to CPA firms all the time, that they're doing well in some areas and not so much in others. They've got audit nailed and they've got tax nailed, but their business model and their firm and their processes or their finance or their outsourcing and talent, people stuff, you've got to even all of that up, I guess, to be wholly transformative.
You've hit on it exactly. And that's, again, bringing this whole holistic picture in. A lot of firms have done one thing here or there. And so we're really looking at the whole picture. And that's one of the things that we do is we have actually a transformation assessment that we do that looks at 6 major areas of a firm. But within that, it's actually 89 different organizational competencies. Whoa. Where we say, okay, what is the firm doing in all of these different areas? And we actually scorecard them in terms of where are you now, where do you want to be, and what's then the gap, or where they're, maybe within one area, like the people area, you're doing, say, 10 out of the 30 things really well. What about the other 20? Maybe these are opportunities for improvement.
And I can see how that would be so valuable to a firm, because that idea of proximity bias, you get so close to what you do, you don't see it as remarkable. You don't know what's best practice and what isn't. So you're giving them those standards, if you like, and showing them where the gaps are, what they're missing, that they may not even have thought about.
Completely. Yeah, and you mentioned best practice. So I'll also mention that the assessment that we do has 4 levels, and we call it the 4 Bs. Okay. The first is below basic, which we consider non-compliant, or especially if like there's a compliant law or regulation that you need to comply with. So below basic is going to be you're not actually complying, or you're where we're seeing firms actually getting to have problems. The basic level is generally mainstream, but it's kind of like you're doing things at, as it says, a very basic level. The end point is the best, which you've mentioned, the best practices. But what we also find, and actually maybe I might take back a little of what I said, but that firms are not often willing to do the best practices. They don't have the time, or it's just not as important. So we've identified kind of this middle ground that we call the better practice. And this is what we're seeing, perhaps the early majority starting to adopt, or firms that are really excelling are really starting to do this type of stuff if they're not at the best level. Yeah. And so we have this scale that we kind of help people really think through, like, what really makes sense for my firm.
And these blueprints that you're talking about, what I do know about best practice is that it's evolving, because what was best practice last year or pre-pandemic is not necessarily best practice now. So you're setting out these blueprints. Just talk to us as an example about the tax blueprint and the tax return preparation automation. So talk to us a little bit about that, Donny, and what's involved there.
Sure. I'll talk in a little bigger picture first, because you brought up a really good point, is that these things are not static, and everyone knows technology is not static. And so it's even if you were to adopt a blueprint, one of our blueprints now, that doesn't mean, say, 2 or 3 years from now, you need to revisit it again, right? So it's all about continually looking at the whole picture, and kind of towards that same concept is the way that we work with clients is we say, where do you want to be 3 to 5 years from now? So tell us where this endpoint is. And then we look at where they are now
Mm.
and we build a transformation roadmap for them to get there. And and through this, we normally will identify like at least 30 projects that say over the course of the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to do these 30 projects. Here's kind of the sequence. And we work with firms to really like prioritize that. And then as things change, as we go through year to year, as projects, maybe sometimes as a result of a project, they learn something, say, ooh, we're not doing so good in this other area. Oh, that's a project here. Maybe we better accelerate that. Or there's maybe been a change in the technology. So year to year, as we revisit the roadmap with clients, we say, well, here are the changes that have come in, and this is what you should be aware of. Is your prioritization still the same? Is your vision actually still the same? So we work through a lot of that. So with tax, though, as you've mentioned, that's where, unfortunately, for tax side, there's not usually a ton of change in tax technology. That's actually both a boon and a bane to the tax side.
Mm.
What we find is changing in the tax side is really kind of the staffing and the need for better maturity and processes. Us coming originally from the IT area, we saw a lot of this with the original IT outsourcing out to India. A lot of that occurred out in late 90s, early 2000s. And there was a certain level of process maturity that was needed. CMMI, if people are familiar with that, that really needed to be adopted. So we're looking at all of this type of stuff, and you immediately hear CMMI. Most people probably haven't heard of it, and something comes from Gartner, and immediately you go, well, this is big companies. Again, what we do is we look and we say, okay, how do we adapt that down and make it usable by somebody that's smaller? And what is the appropriate level of process maturity? Again, maybe it's not at the best level. Maybe it just needs to be at the better level. Now, if you're operating in this way, how do I then collaborate with remote staff, outsourced staff, offshore staff? Because it could be onshore, it could be offshore.
Mm.
So that's really the thing that we're looking at now is how does tax return preparation change if I'm using offshore? Because it's not a matter of me just taking a file and handing it over to someone at the next desk, because the next desk is millions of miles away, right?
I totally get that. You change A, and then that has a knock-on effect for B, C, and D. Or if you
Yeah.
change A in a different way, that has a different knock-on effect. Give us another example with audit, Donny. I understand you've got an innovation awareness for audit, some kind of a source course, and that lets people know where they're at. And there's lots of things to consider there, isn't there, with your research?
Yeah, yeah. So audit's an interesting one, and I'll tell you a little story about how we ended up doing this innovation awareness for audit course. So we actually had a large firm in New York approach us, and they came to me and said, "We know you're I'll use your word. We know you're a legend in the industry, and that you know a lot about audit. My background actually is audit. I did both financial audit and IT audit." So they were like, we know you know a lot about audit. Can you come in and consult with us and tell us how to transform our audit practice? And I went, I can come in and give you ideas around what you might want to do,
Mm.
but it's going to be terribly cost prohibitive. I don't think you would want it. I don't think I would want to do it either, to look at every single audit and tell you, you should use technology here. You should use data analytics there. You should, do all this stuff.
And there's 1,000 ways to innovate audit, I would think, even though it's
Ex
fairly standard. Yeah.
Exactly. And you need to understand the client and you need to understand the methodology, the nuances of the methodology. Like there's a lot of things that occur in audit. And so that's where I told them, I think what we can do instead is do something where we raise awareness. So that's the innovation awareness. We raise the awareness of your staff on what innovations are possible. And again, this is more than just technology uh, in audit. And then as they go through the audits themselves, they can start to identify these opportunities. And PwC actually had done this. So we're using we've kind of looked at the PwC model around how they took it. And in the US, they actually had, I forget the name of a course, but they had a course that they made all of their US staff, all the way through partners, including all the admin staff, go through this course around. These are the key things. So, for example, our innovation awareness course covers data analytics, data visualization, blockchain, automation, which includes robotic process automation and artificial intelligence. And then we also talked about the future of audit, just to paint the picture of this is where audit is going to go in the next, again, kind of 3 to 5 years. And we created this course that was intended to raise the awareness of the audit team, the admin team, the partners, because oftentimes the partners feel intimidated, stupid. And so we said, well, you know what, Harry, just look at this so that you at least understand the basics of someone says, oh, I want to use RPA. What is RPA? Well, then we can start to, they can do that. And the idea is that you take this course, you have all the staff take it, and they're now able, as they go through their engagements, to say, hey, maybe there's this thing. Maybe we can use data analytics here instead of doing traditional testing. And then what the firm then needs to do is identify some champions within the firm that are, we call them transformation agents, that are people that have more of an intermediate level of understanding of these things. So someone, for example, that's trained to build the RPA, the accounting robots or audit robots, as it might be. So a person can take the idea to them, say, hey, I think we could do this here. And then you've got someone that can validate and say, yeah, that makes sense. Let me try and do something for you that maybe actually create the robot. And then if they figure out, I'm actually hitting a limitation, then the third escalation, or I guess second escalation, is to the IT team. Hey, we really need some help. And probably, then starting to look at how do I do data acquisition, the more technical stuff. So now you've got not just 1 or 2 people that have to do this innovation. You've got the whole firm, and then a subset of that as well. That's not just, again, kind of just IT, because it's hard to find core IT people. And the other thing that we found is that you can't take an IT person and throw them into audit. The way that we think about audit, the way that we think about risk and controls is very different than anything else. And so trying to pull an IT person even into your audits and go, here, help me find a way to improve this, that doesn't work either.
Yeah. One of the things you do well, Donny, is when it comes to knowing what works, is not to put a finger in the air and see which way the wind's blowing. You do a lot of research and you collaborate a lot on this. So you've got very hard evidence for what is provable and what really makes the difference. Talk to us a little bit about your approach to research.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you recognize that, because I do think that's one of the things that differentiates me.
Well, everyone's an expert, you see. Everyone thinks they know the right answer, and the world is full of silver bullets and magic solutions. But it comes down to knowing what works through experience and track record, and this is what you monitor.
It is, exactly. And I use blockchain as kind of an example in that a lot, where there was all this hype around blockchain, and I was sitting there going, I don't get it. I don't understand why everyone thinks this is going to solve all the world's problems. Like, it's kind of cool, but it's based on a technology from like the 70s, linked list technology. And all they did was embed cryptography over that. And then I got to see they talk about these smart contracts, and then I got to see how these smart contracts are created. And I went, that's just traditional programming. And it's sort of event-based programming, which has also been around since the 90s. There's nothing particularly new or innovative here that I think is going to transform business. And so I kind of sat and waited, though, because I was like, everyone is talking about this, and this is crazy. I don't see it. And I tried to model out, said, well, how would I see this blockchain adoption occurring? So this is part of the way that I will think through things is, again, we kind of have these blueprints where we look at it and we say, okay, here's what the accounting process looks at. Where would I put blockchain? Blockchain actually, when we looked at it, would fall in the same places that you would put EDI, electronic data interchange. And EDI has been with us, I think it's since the 80s. And then we went, well, the other thing that blockchain does is it brings all these parties together, because EDI was really one party to another party, right? Peer-to-peer kind of a transmission. So these consortiums, that's actually the value-added networks, or the VANs, like Ariba is still around today. That's also from the 90s. And so I went back and I said, well, why did these things not get broader adoption? Because we don't see everyone using these things. And the whole need for the consortium and consensus around what is the data we're transmitting, how is that formatted, and all this type of stuff that's the things I look at that and I go, well, blockchain's going to have that same problem because there's no standard out there. There's nothing that's driving that. And, so I was quiet for a long time. And then finally, we're like 3, 4 years into this blockchain. And I started saying, you know what? I'm going to start saying that I don't think it's going to do this. And I had my reasons. And the other thing that I do it as part of my courses, is I like to present to accountants, this is what something does, and this is the way that it works, and this is the way it'll fit in the accounting process. And I survey back. So whether if I'm speaking, I do polling. If it's like a webinar, we might do a survey type of research to then say, what do you, accountant, see as the potential, given that this is the way this thing is going to implement? And we're seeing the same things. So our research methodology is really one, kind of just rethink through something, compare it to the blueprints that we have of how we know something works, look ourselves, figure out what our position is, but in the spirit of trying to get a objective and unbiased thought out there, we provide a description of what it is, and then we ask the audience, which are accountants, and I speak at probably 30 to 40 events a year, of tell us what you think. Is this going to change something? So we ask, what is the severity of change here? Is it no change or immaterial? Is it mild, moderate, or severe? And we're purposely using words that come back from risk management, so that it's terms that accountants are familiar with, and we're not having to define what is it better, like any those types of things. And we find that a lot of accountants, again, kind of in the blockchain, are going, it's probably mild, maybe moderate for some that have a lot of supply chain implementations. As I say that, I should say, I don't mean that blockchain is not going to have everything. The supply chain implications of blockchains are huge, but they're not accounting implications necessarily. No. Right?
And for many people, really... blockchain's a little bit far away. What is here and now is things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know you've looked at that as well, haven't you?
We have, and a great example of switching from technology into the non-technology aspects
the people
of innovation.
Side.
Yeah, so DE&I is really part of the people changes that we need to see there. We did some research with about 20 promotional partners looking at DE&I practices. So the thing that sparked this was we're looking at these diversity and originally diversity and inclusion practices, right? And I sat there because I would listen to these updates around what was happening, and I would hear people say, we're spending millions of dollars on diversity and trying to get minorities and all this stuff, and we're not making any progress. And I kept sitting there thinking, why are we not making progress? And do people not believe that this is actually important? And going back to the AICPA had done CPA Horizons 2025 back in 2012. And so that was when I was part of the advisory panel there that was looking at, so the research was actually done in 2011. We were looking at 2025 to say, okay, in 14 years from now, what does the profession look like? And it's scary. We're only like 2.25 years away from that. But what does the profession look like? And one of the aspects was the beiging of the profession, or beiging of the world, really. The fact that we were starting to see more interracial marriages, right? It's not just a white dominant culture, and that a lot of the minorities were starting to gain more traction and more per se presence within the profession.
Beijing meaning the homogenization, not the country,
exactly.
the city Beijing. I was just thinking there. Yeah, yep. I get what you mean. Yep. More of a blending.
Exactly. And also the fact that the white is not going to be the majority anymore, especially here in the US. It's not the majority anymore. And so the conversation was really coming up of like, how do we deal with this? And so from 2012, which is when the research was actually released, till a couple of years ago, really I was kind of looking at it and going, we have not made a lot of progress, and we're spending not millions but billions of dollars in here. You look at what all of the different associations are doing, right? What is actually going on in the US? We had all of the riots and things that were occurring over the course of the pandemic because of the discrimination and the the police discrimination, other things that were occurring. And I really kind of sat and thought, you know, what's going on here? And then the Boomer Group actually organized a consortium of DE&I people. And I'm purposely using the word people because it was a mix of consultants, core HR people, people like myself that are consultants to the profession, but not necessarily specialized in HR. There's some HR consultants, there's some DE&I consultants. So they had a good mix of people that they pulled together, you know, all kind of thought leaders in the profession. And we were talking about the issues, and everyone had different ideas around, well, what do we need to do to get this? And, you know, if someone's like, we need to make mandatory DE&I education the same way we need to have ethics education mandatory. And I went, I don't know if that's actually the right answer. But, you know, everyone kind of had their idea of what they thought had to happen. And there was definitely not a consensus.
No.
So going back to research and data, I was like, well, I want to know what the profession thinks it needs and what do they see. And so we created this DE&I journey research study, which is really looking at this DE&I journey. That's all, everything we look at as a journey, the transformation journey, the DE&I journey in this case, and how do we accelerate the journey? So how do we get people faster to where we want to get them? So we identified all of the different phases in the journey, the different things that help accelerate different parts of the journey. And we said, hey, how important is this? How helpful would this be to you? And that was what we asked in our survey. And we're still actually compiling the results, but the one that clearly was the standout from the preliminary things that I looked at was the need for an assessment and a roadmap along the journey. So that's probably, you heard me say we do assessments earlier. So that's probably going to be one of our next big projects is let's create an assessment around DE&I to help organizations really understand where are they. And you know, there's a few of them out there, but most of them are designed for really large companies.
Yes.
And so we're going to look at doing one that's more for small and mid-size.
Well, thank you for that, Donny. This is really enlightening. And D and I've also heard the A put on the end of that, which is accessibility, and just an example of how things are evolving all the time. We'll put your contact details in the show notes, Donny, so that people can reach out to you. But would you just leave us with a couple of tips for the accounting professionals listening to be a little bit more innovative in their thinking and pivot a little bit better in these challenging times?
Sure. So let's start first with what you said earlier, which was, you know, accountants are not innovative. So first there, I think it's to first start with, I don't want to adopt something just because someone else is doing it. I need to start first with what are the core issues that I'm having? So whether they're staffing, whether it's workflow, whether it's we're not delivering things on time, we're missing deadlines, start with the problem. Then I like the 5 whys approach, which I think comes from Lean Six Sigma. Say, how do you go back and ask yourself 5 times? So if we're late on something, why are we late? And we're late because people are not reviewing things timely. Well, why are we not reviewing things timely? Well, there's too much work on their desk. Well, why is there too much work on their desk? Could be a variety of reasons. Maybe there is just too much work, right? So the solution is to get more people. Maybe it's that person themselves is overloaded. Maybe it's one person that's the bottleneck. We need to spread the work out some more. Maybe that person's a hoarder of work, so we need to spread it, right? So start with the problem. Ask yourselves the 5 whys to figure out what actually is going on, and also potentially to brainstorm and look at what are the potential options or solutions? How could we do this? And then start to look for the solution. And that will help people make sure that they're doing a pivot that is actually meaningful and is looking at the holistic picture of what's happening.
Yeah, that's been excellent. Donny SHIMAMOTO, we really appreciate your time today and your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.